welcome to Soaring the Sky, Glider Pilots Podcast. Hello, my name is Chuck. I'll be your host. This is episode 27. This episode is brought to you by Arizona Soaring Incorporated, the nation's largest provider of professional glider training. Since 1969, they provided training from initial private through CFI glider and entry level through advanced aerobatics. Open year-round, 7 days a week. More information is available at azsoaring.com. On today's episode, we first head down to Richmond, Virginia, and check back with Chris Snyder, who tells us about his first cross-country experience in his glider. He also tells us about what his club is doing to help out the Civil Air Patrol. Later on in this episode, we'll be heading out to Southern California and catch up with Joe Capra to see what he's been up to. And recently, he's purchased his very own glider. He tells us about that, as well as transitioning from a two-seater into a single-seater. All that today right here on Soaring the Sky. Chris Snyder, welcome back to the podcast. It's great to talk to you again. How you been?
Oh, Chuck, thanks. It's great to be back. I've been doing real well. I have just been loving the sky.
Oh, great. Now, you were flying the DG-200 the last time we spoke.
That's correct, and it's still a great ship. I love having a flapped ship. I don't know how important they are, but it just gives, as my buddy said, it gives your left hand something to do.
Right, exactly. Recently, you've done a cross-country, right?
Yeah, I had been really reluctant to leave that safe, glide range from home. I would push maybe out to about 20 to 1. The UDI would tell me I'm really kind of getting near the edges of that safe zone. And that's about as far as I would push, especially in our area. There's really not much landable terrain, especially in certain directions, particularly as it gets more urban to the east. So not wanting to put my glider in the trees for sure, but not even in a field or anything in between. I would just keep the stress pretty low. But it was maybe 3 weeks ago now, I took off without a lot of expectation because our club hotshot, our OLC champion, he went up and came right back down. So I'm thinking, this isn't going to be a good day. We're just going to get a little pattern practice in, and then we'll come back and we'll just shoot the breeze. Well, I get off tow, and I did hear a call from the 233 that he had connected with some lift, and he was bumping up cloud base at 4,000, maybe 4,500. And so I catch a good thermal on tow, and I'm up, and I'm like, oh, okay, well maybe this will work. Maybe Pete just got a little unlucky, and so I start working that lift, and I see the 233, which oftentimes the 233 is way above me. I'm no great stick, but I'll certainly share a thermal if there's an obvious one. So I ease over to the 233 and, just loving it. But I'm looking to the south and I see there's some rain down there. That's interesting. And so I cruise a little further, down the road, listen to my buddy Pete's getting towed up for a relight. And I look at that cloud again and I'm like, that is bigger and darker than last time. So I radio down, like, hey guys, are you tracking that rain? And they're all like, oh yeah, I think it's going to pass south. It's going to pass south. I'm like, okay, kind of looks close. And so I pull up one of my my Power Flight apps. I use a Wing X, and it's got the ADS-B radar in, and I'm actually low enough. I'm still catching it off the cell towers. And I check that cell, and I'm like, ugh, that cell is getting awful close to Merlin. And it just keeps building, and I'm catching some big thermals now, like 5, 6, 7 knots steady going up. And I'm thinking, this air is a bit more dynamic than I had expected, right? And so that rain definitely is starting to build into some storm, right? I hear somebody calling the radio, yeah, we just saw lightning down past Blackstone. Be advised. So by this time, my buddy Pete's up, and he's catching some good thermals. And so I'm like, hey, Pete, what do you think about that storm? He's like, yeah, it's not looking too good. And so I'm about 1 minute from just popping the dive brakes, running, back to the runway. But even that's getting a little dicey because I'm thinking, is there going to be a gust front in front of that storm? So I'm getting a little nervous, right? This has got that hallmarks of, pilot error. And so I'm thinking, but Pete said, he's like, hey, why don't we go to Farmville, let that storm pass through? That's a safe place. There's a big runway. The weather looks great that direction. So I'm thinking, all right, let's do this. Today's the day. I'm going cross country. So,
Nice.
he and I, we find a nice cloud street, run in that direction, and we're bouncing off the bottom of the clouds, 6,000 feet all the way. And thinking back to all those SSA webinars I'd heard, running energy lines and, taking it cross country. And I'm like, this is awesome. Why haven't I been doing this the whole time? And I'm spotting fields as I go. And the Udi's like, you could make it to Washington, D.C., Not really, but, it's being pretty optimistic about
Right.
and pretty soon we've got Farmville made, and so I'm like, wow, this is awesome. And about that time, Pete's looking at, and he's been on gold distance flights. He's done this many, many times. So he looks at those next clouds. He's like, "Oh, Chris, I don't know. This next clouds, they don't look the same. They don't look quite as good." And I'm thinking now, I just come 25 miles. I'm good, right? I know a cloud. That cloud out there, Pete, that looks good, man. That looks real good. Let's just keep pushing, because it's also right over the airport too, right? So I'm thinking,
Right.
Safety. It's not like we're really, pushing ourselves into a corner. And sure enough, Pete was right. That we left that 6,000 foot cloud, and I didn't find lift again for the next 40 minutes. And I was scratching and clawing, and Pete's like, maybe a little to the left, Chris. I'm circling over this, junkyard. I'm getting 2 knots up, and I move a little left, and there's nothing. I move a little right, nothing, and I'm having to kind of keep creeping in closer and closer to that airport that's down there. And I'm like, Pete, I got to call on the radio. We had switched to our chatter frequency. So I call up the approach frequency for this Class E airport, Farmville. And I say, hey, glider, may need to land soon, because there was another plane doing some touch and goes. And so he's like, okay, I'll hold here. So now I'm like, oh gosh, now I got extra pressure, because there's no taxiway. He can't taxi back if I'm just hanging off the end of his runway, and I'm just not having any luck. And so I'm like, oh, this is bad. I'm gonna have to, my first cross country is gonna be my first land out, and I was really, really getting pretty bummed. But I was like, you know what? Let's just put this thing down. Having an arrow tow home, or worst case, having them bring the trailer, no big deal. Let's just not, break any fiberglass or break any bones. So I call Farmville pattern. I'm like, all right, glider transiting cross, entering the pattern, and then whoa, beep, beep, beep. Bump into a real strong thermal, right about 1,100 feet AGL.
Oh, nice.
And complete with an eagle in it, right? He's already doing turns in it.
Oh,
So
wow.
I radio down real quick. I'm like, okay, hey guys, I'm really trying to dig this out. You guys go ahead, taxi back, take off. I'm holding here, and so and actually I'm making 2 knots, 2.5. I'm like, wow, this is that thermal, and so I sit there and work that thermal for the next 15 minutes. Must have been. Finally get back up to 4,000. Meanwhile, Pete's been holding my place over the city, and he's like, come back, come join me. And we'll start working our way back, because at this point, I had been really struggling. So the day is wearing on, and even if at this point the thermals are starting to get maybe a little weak and spotty. So, but Pete locks us into a nice 6,300 foot climb, and our MSL is only about 200 feet, so we're well over 6,000 feet above the ground. And Udi says, I've got about 800 feet. Pete got even a couple hundred feet higher. He's like, Chris, I really think we need to just set home, because that storm that had come through just blew out the rest of the sky. And so now I'm thinking, oh man, I've only got 800 feet, and we're still 25 miles from home. I've never done a final glide, not a real one, right? Where you lock it in on like, say, Best Glide or a little better, and trust that flight computer. Oh, you want to talk about some stress, right? Here I am watching those numbers count down, and maybe, there were a couple landable fields we have marked, but I really didn't want to try to find them because they're tough to spot, and I'm thinking that adrenaline starts flowing, and I'll bet fields start looking real tricky. So that was the best feeling, watching that still air just keep counting down, and the Udi would drop maybe 10 feet in here, but it'd pick up another 10 feet, drop 10 feet, pick up 10 feet. So she did a good job. A DG 200 did a good job bringing me home that day. And I tell you what, I've got a taste for it, and I can't wait to go on my next cross country.
Well, congratulations! What an awesome flight.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it was a real treat. And then everyone was waiting back at base. They opened up a bottle of wine. We're celebrating. So
Nice.
to be able to share a time like that with all your buds at the glider field, it's a great sport. I really love soaring for that.
Absolutely. Now, I know we talked about it before. You fly some powered too, but have you done any towing lately?
It's one of those things. It's a necessary evil, but for me, I try to put myself behind the tow plane more than in it.
Right.
And thankfully, we've recruited a bunch of good tow pilots. I will say there was one, weekday where work was a little slow, and I heard the guys say, "Hey, we're headed out to do some soaring." I knew I couldn't, go soaring. I didn't have that much time, but I figured, well, maybe I'll just go out, have lunch with them. I'll just hang out. And the fellow that was going to tow that day, he's like, "Well, since you're here, can you tow me, and I'll go soaring." So that worked out real well. That was a nice spontaneous, just two tows. That's enough towing for me for a while. I'll go back
Right.
into the glider. But very thankful to our tow pilots who work those long days, especially when we have all the students.
Yeah, absolutely. It can get really busy for sure. Speaking of students, you all are doing something with the Civil Air Patrol now, right?
That's right. In Virginia, the Civil Air Patrol has a Blanik L-23, and that they've struggled with their program to keep enough tow pilots and glider pilots because they have more of a emergency services focus. And so when I saw that it was being maybe a little underutilized, and maybe even a chance that it might get moved to a wing that was doing more with them, I said, I'll bet if you all brought that glider out to Merlin, we could tow it up, and a couple of our members will join the Civil Air Patrol, and we'll become orientation pilots, and we'll be able to take the cadets up, and that's been a real successful program. We average about 10 to 15 cadets a month. Will get their first taste of soaring, and the really neat thing is the Air Force pays for the cadets to have 5 powered orientation flights as well as 5 glider orientation flights. So,
oh, nice.
These kids, if they really get a taste for it, they'll be able to come back and they have different, skills that they learn each time. And, a few of them have even gotten to do some thermaling and stay up a little longer. But, really we're introducing, another generation. And I tell you, these kids they're so pumped to do it. They so look forward to it. This weekend, we've got a group coming from maybe about 100 miles across the state of Virginia, and they each take turns running the wing, so they get the full experience. We get them running some of the ground ops. They're always shadowed by a senior member or a Merlin member whose job it is to maintain a safe environment. But as much as we can, we get these kids fully involved, and we expect that we're going to start to see them come back into the flight training program.
Yeah, they're definitely getting the whole experience of soaring. That's very cool. The whole operation just...
Yeah, and it's something that, it takes a little bit of logistical working out, but, I believe there's over 30 gliders, so not quite one glider per state, but if folks living, in other states, find out about their Civil Air program, potentially they can work with the Civil Air Patrol if they find a similar situation. And the Civil Air Patrol also allows states that don't have gliders to work with clubs, and clubs can then supply, say, like a 233 for the cadets to go up in as well.
That's a great idea to get those clubs involved in that when normally, it's something you don't always think about. But that's very cool that you all are doing that, and yeah, it's a great idea for other clubs to start doing that.
Yeah, as we all look for ways to try to engage with, keep soaring as a growing sport. This is a group of young people that are very passionate about aviation. And, that's generally why they join it. They have maybe a desire to go to a service academy or get their pilot's license. And I think all of us in the sport of soaring know what a great way to start off an aviation career, if you will, or even just, a hobby, is to do it in gliders. And a couple pilots that I know that fly both, they started in gliders, and it was a very easy transition for them to move into airplane.
It is, yeah, it is a great start. It's really, when possible, should be the first start. I think gliders should be the way you go, and then move on from there if you want to fly other aircraft.
Yeah, absolutely. And I tell folks that it's how else spending 4 hours in the Piper Cherokee. I better be getting somewhere really interesting, right? I think it was about 6 hours to get down to Sun and Fun this year, and we were all whooped. But 4 hours in my glider, it goes by, and I'm thinking, oh, I could have done this differently, or I should have stretched that corner a little further. It's such a different experience, and it's one too where sharing thermals with other pilots is just, it's magic.
It is. It's a lot of fun. Chris, thanks for joining me again on the podcast. It's been great to catch up with you. And
absolutely, Chuck. It's a pleasure to be on again, and I tell you, I always look forward to each episode, and just love everything that I'm hearing on the podcast.
You all as guests have been great and have really been a great help to me, and it's just kind of all worked out, and I'm having a lot of fun, but I'm learning a lot myself, which is also very, very cool.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, it's a great thing you're doing for the sport. So thanks for doing all that you're doing.
Thanks again, Chris. Always great to have you on the podcast. Next, we head out to Southern California and check with Joe Capra and see what he's been up to lately. Joe, how are you doing?
Thanks for having me again, Chuck. It's been a while since I was last on the podcast.
Absolutely.
I think at that time, I was still flying the ASK 21, two-seater. I was ready to go into a single seater, but for some reason I was a little bit hesitant just because, obviously I haven't flown, you can't fly a single seater with an instructor. So I was, just a little hesitant, like probably everybody is. And so, I had it all planned, and, I was going to do it at some point, and it kind of just happened unexpectedly. I showed up, and I had a glider reserved, and the one that I had reserved, something happened with the wheel, and they had to replace the wheel, and they're waiting for the mechanic and this and that. And so they said, well, the single seat Grobe is free. If you want to fly that, you can take that. So I kind of was not forced into it, but it just came upon me, and I said, okay, well, now I guess is better time than ever. So
kind of how the solo gets put on you, right? Like, oh, are you ready?
Yeah, it was the same kind of thing. And I was ready, and I looked at the manual for that glider, and it's a Grobe 102 standard 3B or something like that. All the Grobes have weird, a bunch of different variations. But anyways, I looked at the manual for it and the speeds and everything. So I was ready, but I wasn't, it's like that thing when all of a sudden the instructor hops out and they're like, okay, you're on your own. So it's kind of that. It's like, oh, I guess this is happening. So I sat in the glider and the single seater, the Grobe, and just checked everything out and had them sort of go over things with me of what to check on the pre-flight, and because things are a little bit different. So I spent some time with it just on the ground and finally took it up. And that flight was actually a pretty interesting flight because the tow pilot, I talked to him afterwards. Well, let me actually just start with what happened. So, I got in and, lined up on the runway. Everything was good. Tow plane starts going and everything's good. I lift off, and maybe once we get up to about 50 to 100 feet, I notice I'm really, really low and can't get much higher. And it felt like we were just going really, really slow. And so I didn't know if it was just me or the glider or what's going on. But, I kept trying to stay level with the tow plane, and I just was kind of kept just wallowing in the back of the tow plane. And I'm like, this is really weird and kind of freaky. I looked at the airspeed indicator, and it looked like, we were going pretty slow. So I told him to add, 5 knots, and that helped. But I still kind of was like just wallowing in the back, just kind of nose was getting a little high, and it didn't feel right. So I told him to add another 5 knots. So he finally got up to about, 60, 65, whatever it was. And everything was pretty good after that. But that was a scary thing kind of to happen in, on your first flight in a single seater, is we were just going way too slow on tow, and it was very hard to control the glider and stay in position. So that was an interesting start to this flight. But I talked to the tow pilot afterwards, and he thought, well, this is it's a single seater. It's not one of the heavy ASKs. I can tow a little bit slower. And so I guess that's what he did. And apparently it didn't work too well.
Yeah. And what a time to find that out when it's your first ride in a single seater.
Yeah. I mean, it was an interesting takeoff, I'll tell you that. But everything turned out good. I went up and I don't know, probably just flew around for a half hour. But the difference between the heavy ASKs, the 2-seaters, and the small single seat Grobe was amazing. I mean, the thing was so light and nimble, and I was just like, oh my god, this is awesome. So immediately I was hooked and having fun in that thing. It's just, it was awesome. So I did a few more flights in that. I think probably only like 3 or 4. And then at the Soaring Academy where I fly, they post up, listings for gliders for sale. And some guy was selling his Grobe 102 Austere CS. And I was like, oh, that's cool. It's kind of like the one I flew. And, I was kind of just kept looking at the ad, and I was like, yeah, I don't know. And then I decided to ask, the guys at the Soaring Academy, hey, can I go actually just look at that glider and see, just look at it and sit in it and whatever. And so they were really cool, and we got it out of the trailer, and, I sat in it and looked it over, and I'm like, okay, it's pretty good shape. The price is reasonable, a little bit higher than what it, I think it should have been. But that aside, I looked at it a few times actually, and then I decided, okay, I think I can pull this off. I mean, that glider, if it flies like the first single seater I flew, the Grobe 102, whatever, I guess it was standard 3B, it would be an awesome glider to own as a first glider. I mean, I know it's nothing crazy. It's not a great, competition glider or, anything like that. But for me at my level, I was like, that's kind of the perfect thing. It's a small single seater. It's got like 38-to-1 glide ratio, I think is what it's advertised as. So that's pretty good. The only difference that was a little, I was a little worried about is that, it was a tail dragger, which I hadn't flown any tail dragger gliders, and that's a little different. So I was kind of like, oh, is it going to be harder to land and take off and do all that? But after flying it, come to find out it's just the same as the other ones. But yeah, I mean, it seemed to fit the bill perfectly for what, kind of, I guess I was looking for as a first glider. I mean, I actually wasn't really looking to buy a glider, but it was there. And so, yeah, it fit the bill for, something that I could see myself in for first glider. So when I thought about it and started looking actually on Wings and Wheels after, I got really into like, looking at gliders to buy, just the cheapest ones. I wasn't going to spend 30 grand or 40, anything crazy on one at this point. Yeah. So I thought it over. I looked at it a few times again and just decided to go ahead and, put in an offer and try to buy it. And it worked out. I ended up buying it. That's what I've been flying ever since. I've had probably 5 or 6 4 to 4.5 hour flights in it so far. And
oh, very cool.
It's really comfortable. It's really fun to fly. Yeah, and it's just I got oxygen in it, which is good, so I can hang out at higher altitudes for longer. So that was really cool. It's got an audio variometer, which is what I've wanted one of those ever since I started flying, because I found myself, I kept looking at the vario, and I know you don't really need to or shouldn't, but I kept doing it, and I was like, well, if I just had some audio tone telling me, I wouldn't have to, keep looking at the vario, and I can keep my eyes out. So that was really cool. But yeah, I mean, it's been a very interesting learning experience. Just, now you got to worry about all the stuff related to ownership and getting annuals and getting mechanics to fix things and sign off on things and this and that. And it's a lot of extra stuff you kind of need to learn and get to know quickly, because you now own this thing and are responsible for it. So I've been pretty busy with that, and also just kind of fixing it up, doing things like that. So
if you back up a little bit, when you purchase the glider, because being in a club like you and I mean, that's not something I've done yet, so it's not something I think about. But you just go to the club. If a glider's available, you go and you go fly. But what was that like? So you purchased it, and then obviously you have to check out all the paperwork, make sure everything's good, make sure it's flight worthy. If not, then you have to get that checked out. But just kind of walk me through it.
Yeah. So pretty much everything you said is the purchase process is pretty easy. You just agree on a price and hand over the money, and he gives you the registration, all the stuff. And before I purchased it, I had an annual inspection done. It was actually due for an annual inspection, but I was just going to do it anyways, just to have it checked out and make sure everything is still good. And so I got the annual before I purchased it, and then went ahead and purchased it. I had a couple things I had to fix. I had to kind of fix the brakes a little, get a new tow hook, things like that. And that actually kind of took a while, just because I had to figure out what parts I needed, what was the right wheel on there, what was the right tire size, and what kind of tow hook was in there, and then waiting, to get a mechanic out to actually install it and sign it off and do all that. It was some work initially up front, just getting it. And I haven't done this before, obviously, so I didn't really know what I was supposed to do, the process and everything. But obviously I knew the FARs and things that you need to have done and all that. Yeah, I found it really hard just trying to find exactly what part I needed, so that I can buy a replacement or an alternate. And this glider is not an experiment, doesn't have an experimental certificate, so it's standard. So everything has to be, TSO'd and approved, all of that stuff. So it made it a little bit harder to kind of do things, and you can't really work on it as much yourself as you could if it was experimental. So there's a lot of things I wanted to do but couldn't really do myself.
Yeah, that's interesting, because that's not something I would think about right away, not being experimental, putting you in different guidelines.
There were a lot of things that I know I could do myself. Like installing the tow hook, for example, it was a very easy process. You unscrew 4 bolts, you put the thing in, and put the 4 bolts back in and torque them down, and that's it. And that's something I could have done myself, but being, I guess I'm assuming you would have to get it done by a mechanic with an experimental, maybe. Again, I don't know all the rules with that, but yeah, it was something I had to have a mechanic do, and then they got to sign off for it. And that was actually a big pain, because not having the mechanic do it, but just finding what tow hook was actually in there. So, they have different varieties of them, and they have different levers, length of levers that go on the thing that, the cable hooks to and pulls it. So, we had to kind of pull it out and put a little camera in there to kind of take a picture of it. And then I sent that to Wings and Wheels, and they kind of identified it for me. And they didn't have the one that I needed in stock, so we got a different one, and the mechanic had to modify it and kind of cut this lever off. And it's just like all of this stuff. And it's just like, geez, I'm like, I don't want to be tinkering with this anymore. I just want to fly it, at that point.
Yeah, right.
It probably took me 2 months before I was able to really fly it, to get all the just stuff that needed to get done and find the right things. And so it was a interesting experience. But now that I've done it, and I don't want to dissuade anybody from doing it. I mean, it wasn't like there were just all these little things that for me that I had to go through and before I can actually get it flying. And yeah, but it's now that I own a glider, it's so much better than having to go and rent one. First of all, is you don't have to, there's no schedule, so you fly whenever you want to fly. You can stay up as long as you want. Where I fly, on weekends, I think you can only really rent most of the gliders for 2 hours. So if it's a really awesome day and you want to stay up for, 4 or 5 hours like I've been doing, you can't really do that. So it helps, with that, is I can stay up as long as I want. Yeah, it's and you're only paying for a tow, so it's making it cheaper. So every time I go fly, it's less than $100, which is awesome.
Yeah.
Compared to what it would be if I was, renting.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's a lot of advantages. There's also little things that are, like when you rent, you just show up at the field, you hop in, take off and fly and come back down and just kind of drop the glider off and then hop back in your car and leave. But with, owning your own, mine, I don't store it in the trailer because this glider is kind of a pain to, rig and de-rig. So I keep it rigged and covered out in the open. But, I show up probably an hour and a half beforehand, and I got to take all the covers off, do all that kind of stuff, just get it ready to fly. And then when I land after, 5 hours flying, you're pretty tired. And it's towards the end of the day, and then you land and you got to put all the covers back on. You got to prepare it, get it tied down and make sure everything's good until, next time you fly. And so that adds a couple, like an hour on either end of it. So it's just another little thing that you have to do. It's not as easy as just showing up, flying, and then landing and just taking off. So it ends up taking most of the day when I go fly to prepare it before I fly, and then after I land and get it ready for the night.
Not a bad trade-off, though, to have your own glider and, like you said, fly when you want to fly, stay up as long as you want to stay up, and just the convenience, and of course not having to rent a glider. All that is pretty awesome.
Yeah, it's the benefits definitely outweigh those little things that you got to do extra that you don't have to do when you're renting. But yeah, it's I love it. It's awesome having my having my own glider. I could see myself still renting at this point if I didn't own this, but after a certain point I would go, okay, it's getting pretty expensive at renting, and I'm limited, and if I wanted to change my mind on the day I'm flying, I can't really do that because there's a schedule. So after a while, I probably would have eventually started looking for something to buy. But this one just happened to show up, and it was perfect. It actually, I guess, had been on the same field, I think, since maybe the 70s. So it's a 1977 Grobe, so it's pretty old.
Oh, okay.
Still in great shape, but it's been, I think, at that field pretty much the whole time. And the guy who runs the Soaring Academy now, he owned it for 5 or 6 years. And it's actually pretty funny is people, all the other guys who have private guys who have gliders, parked there, they all see it and recognize it and recognize the tail numbers and everything. And, I talked to these people and they're like, oh yeah, I flew that, I did my first cross country in that thing. And, oh yeah, I have a lot of memorable flights in that thing. So it seems like everybody there has kind of flown it and knows it.
Oh, nice.
So,
lots of history.
Yeah, it's been there for a while, and that's what's I guess good about it is people kind of knew it and knew how it was taken care of and how it was treated and everything. So that kind of made the decision a little easier too, is that these people sort of know its history, and it's not I'm buying something from some random guy who don't really know how well he kept it up or all that kind of stuff. So but yeah, owning your own glider is really awesome if you can afford it. They range from, I've seen them from 8,000 all the way obviously to really expensive, but you can get in a pretty good glider for $8,000-$10,000.
And that's a good used car.
Yeah, it's well worth it. And like somebody said to me, they said, we never really own these gliders. We just pretty much rent them. So, meaning, yes, you own it and you've bought it, but, you sell it and you get a different one. And so after 5 or 6 years, if I'm sick of this or want to get another one, you sell it and they pretty much hold value. assuming everything, is well maintained and whatever. So yeah, it's not like it's a good chunk of money up front, but when you sell it, you've basically just rented it that whole time for very, very cheap. So it ends up actually working out. And that's why I think it's such a good benefit to actually owning one.
So you've had some pretty long flights in that glider. Is there one that stands out?
So there's, at the mountains where we fly, there's a mountain called Mount Baldy, which is maybe 22 to 25 miles away from the airport. And I know a lot of people go over it and fly around it. To me, it always seemed a little bit far, at least for my experience level, to try to get over there. There's this big valley that you're not supposed to cross it, but a lot of people just go across this valley. And I was told stories that people tried to cross this valley and didn't make it back, and they ended up landing in this valley. So, there's an alternate way to get there, is just kind of go along a little mountain range and then kind of cut in. So I'd kind of been eyeing it and figuring if I can make it there. And I'd always wanted to go fly over that. One of the days in flying in my glider, I was high enough and the conditions seemed good enough. I just said, screw it. So I headed straight towards it and made it over there. So that was, a little accomplishment for me to just actually have made it over there, and to make it, in my own glider was pretty cool. I've just been having fun flying it, it's, and the fact that I own it and all that just makes it that much better. Your first glider that you own, that was really cool, just to actually, be in it, finally flying, and not, messing around with it on the ground for the last 2 months. So once I finally got it up in the air, it was really cool to actually just get it up there and get it flying. So yeah, it's been great so far.
Joe, thank you for talking to me today and catching up. It's been good to hear from you again, and it sounds like you've had quite the adventure. Having your own glider is very cool, and looking forward to hearing about those flights in the future that you're going to have with that. And wow, you already got the onboard oxygen. You're ready to go, so you're hooked up for some fun.
Yeah, thanks again for having me, and I'll keep you posted. I'm kind of at the point where I want to start pushing out a little bit further away from the airport. So that's kind of my next thing. I might get a flight computer and just kind of start pushing my boundaries. So it's definitely going to be some more learning and fun in the future. So
thank you, Joe, and thank you, Chris. Thanks for stopping by. It's nice to catch up with both of you. And thank you for listening to Soaring the Sky. You can catch us online, Instagram, as well as Facebook. Those are Soaring the Sky Podcast. You can also get us at soaringthesky.com. Some pictures of our guests. Catch up on the episodes. You can do that right there too. Catch up on all the episodes you haven't heard yet. If you would like to drop us a line, you can also do that. If you just want to say hi, tell us where you're listening from. If you're a glider pilot and you'd like to share your story, just email me at chuck@soaringthesky.com. We hope to see you back here next time for another great guest on Soaring the Sky.